boys and girls. Welcome to Lighthouse Kids Club. This is our Wednesday program. We are looking at Lesson 35 this evening, and you can look on the website for the papers if you don't have the book. And we are going to look at when the people of Israel crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. We saw that Moses had led the people of Israel for 40 long years in the wilderness. And the time had come that they were going to cross over the Jordan River and go into the land that God had given to them. Moses was not going to be allowed to go into the land, and he would die before they all went in. And he was very concerned that God would appoint a new leader for them to take over after he died, that they would be able to follow. And God chose God chose Joshua to be their leader. They watched Moses walk up into the mountain where he died. And after they spent some time mourning for Moses, it was time to move on and follow Joshua's leadership as he led the people of Israel. We saw last week that Joshua sent 2 spies into the city of Jericho so they could see what they were going to be facing when they got there. And we looked at a woman named Rahab who protected them from the leaders of the city and who allowed them to get away from them. Remember, we talked about that city. It was sitting up on a hill. The walls were high. They were thick. They were strong. They had guards standing on top of the walls. It was a huge city, and that was the first city that they were going to attack when they got in there. And we remember that Rahab tied a red rope out her window, and it was hanging down so that the spies would be able to see where her house was. And she left that rope there. She didn't know how long it was going to be till they came back, but she was going to leave that rope hanging right there. And she was waiting. And she waited, and she waited, and she didn't know how long they would be before they came back, but she was going to be ready when they came. As Joshua was going to lead the people of Israel, he was going to look to God for guidance. Joshua would listen for instructions from God, and he would follow God just like Moses had done in his life. God is their authority. God is their leader. God would tell Joshua and the people of Israel what he wanted them to do. They had seen God do amazing things in Egypt. They had seen God do amazing things at the Red Sea and in the wilderness. They didn't know where to go. They didn't know what to do, but God did. And all they had to do was obey him and follow him, because he knows where to go. He knows what to do. God was going to guide them. He was their guide all along the way. If the people of Israel would obey God as their authority, he would lead and guide them and would defeat their enemies for them. God was to be their authority. He would open the way for them even when there was no way to go, just like he did at the Red Sea, and just like he's going to do in our story today. We're going to see what happens. If they would obey him, God would bless them. It's as simple as that. Just do what God says. Not only would God tell them what to do, but he would go before them. He would go in front. He had led them all the time in the wilderness by the pillar of cloud in the daytime and a pillar of fire at nighttime. And on this day, as they crossed the Jordan River, as he led them, and as Joshua, as their leader, would follow God and allow him to lead them, The priests would carry the Ark of the Covenant that they had made when they were building the tabernacle. God had told them how to build the Ark of the Covenant. It represented the very presence of God in the middle of them. They were going to cross the Jordan River to go into the promised land. And the priests were going to go first. They carried the Ark of the Covenant just like God had instructed them to do when they built the tabernacle, with the poles on each of their shoulders, and those 4 priests would carry the Ark of the Covenant. And they would go first in front of the people, carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The people of Israel had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 long years. They had come to the edge of the Jordan River, and it was the only thing between them and this beautiful land that God had promised them. They sent those spies in there, remember? And they brought fruit back, beautiful fruit, big grapes, beautiful pomegranates, beautiful figs. They knew the land was wonderful because of the fruit that it produced. And this river was the only thing between them and that land. But how are they going to get across it? You know, it was bigger than usual. This happens here. When springtime comes and the snow starts to melt on the mountains, the water runs down the mountains, and all the rivers are wider than usual. They're deeper than usual. They're running faster than usual. And that's what this river was like. It was overflowing its banks. It was running fast. It was strong. There was no way they were going to be able to get those people across there, especially with all the children and the animals and the wagons and the little lambs and all their things and all their pots and pans and all their belongings. They weren't going to be able to get across it. The river was the only thing between them and the land that God had promised them. God told the priests that they were to carry the ark as he had told them. And we just looked at this a minute ago. 4 priests, each carrying a pole, holding the end of one of the poles on their shoulders. And they were going to walk right into that river. The priests would go first. I can imagine those guys walking toward the river. What are we going to do when we get there? They didn't know. But God had told them to walk toward the river. I can imagine these guys in the back here thinking, I'm glad I'm not one of the guys in the front, because they're going to get there first. And what are they going to do when they get to that raging river? They didn't know, but God told them to do it. What are they going to do when they get there? The water is so fast. They didn't know, but God told them to do it. I'm wondering if any one of those 4 men thought, everybody is going to think I'm nuts. Everybody's going to think I'm crazy walking toward this river. What am I going to do? It didn't matter. God told them to do it, so that's where they're going. Everybody watched as the priests walked toward that raging river. Joshua was leading them, and he had received instructions from God. Did he hear the instructions correctly? Is this really what God told us to do? Is this what we're supposed to do? But the priests obeyed. And I can imagine those guys in the front thinking, you know, when I step into that river, the water's going to wash me away. I'm going to drop the Ark of the Covenant. Maybe the mud's going to squish up between my toes. But it didn't. They just walked toward the river. And when the first priest put his first foot into the river, boom, the water just stopped. And then all this water just flowed away from them. And what did they see in front of them? No water. A dry riverbed. And they were going to be able to walk across there. And all the people The priest walked in and stood in the middle of the river, and all the people walked across. And the ground was dry. It wasn't even muddy. No mud squishing up between my toes. The ground was dry, and those priests stood there in the middle while all the people walked through. Oh my goodness, they were so thankful that God had kept them safe all this time, and now He's going to allow them to walk across where there was a raging river just a moment ago. The people walked across where the river had been. Now, before the people went across, Joshua had instructed each tribe. There were 12 tribes in Israel, as you remember, and he instructed each tribe to appoint one man to pick up a big stone from the riverbed, and he would carry on his shoulder. You see this guy carrying this stone on his shoulder? They would carry the stone on the shoulder and make a pile of 12 stones on the side of the riverbank right where they walked across. A pile of stones like this. Big stones, not just little pebbles, not just little hand stones, but big stones. And they would make a pile of stones. And they would also make a pile of stones in the riverbed right where they had walked across. And they set up their pile of stones so that everybody could see. Why did they do that? Those stones were a reminder to them. This was an important thing for them. This was a memorial for them, something to remember. They could look at that pile of stones and say, oh, yeah, I remember. Almost forgot about that. But years ago, they would tell their grandchildren, their children and their grandchildren, they might say, what do those stones mean? And they would be able to remember that day when they walked across the Jordan River on dry ground. He dried up the river so we could walk across safely. Just like he had opened the waters of the Red Sea 40 years earlier. That way, the people could always remember that their God is a mighty God, a mighty God. Our God is a powerful and mighty God. They would always remember that there is no obstacle too big that God can't make a way for His people. If they became afraid when they got into the land, they could look at that pile of stones and remind themselves that God is bigger than their enemies. Any enemies, it doesn't matter. Not only, and we need to realize this, not only would the people of Israel be able to see that pile of stones and see and remember that their God is a mighty God, but the heathen people, the people that didn't know God, would be able to see that pile of stones, and they would remember too, God brought the people of Israel across the Jordan River on dry ground. You see, I can imagine the people of Jericho. The city of Jericho was very close to this, where they walked across. I can imagine the people of Jericho sending out spies. Go see what those people are up to. An entire nation of people is right across the river. Go see what they're doing. And I can imagine there were spies hiding so they couldn't be seen, but watching. And I can imagine them looking at that whole nation of people thinking, what are they going to do? They can't go across the river. I can imagine them standing there watching and thinking, what are those guys doing with that box and the sheet on top? What are they doing? I can imagine them watching them walking toward the river, and then I can imagine them seeing the river just, boom, stop, and all the water just running away. I can imagine them saying, oh, did you see that? Oh my goodness. And I can imagine them going back to Jericho and telling the king and his servants, you're not going to believe what we just saw. You're not going to believe it. Those people of Israel were coming toward the river and it just stopped for them. You are not going to believe it. They walked across where the river was, but it was dry, and they came across there. You know, their God is fighting for them. Maybe we're not as safe in Jericho as we thought we were. And they wondered, and they could see that the God of the people of Israel was a mighty God. Not only would the people of Israel know that God is powerful and mighty, but the heathen people, the people that didn't know God, they would know it too. God brought them across there. And those heathen people never needed to think that they were going to be able to defeat the God of Israel. On that day, God made himself very real to the people of Israel, but he also made himself very real to the unbelievers when they saw what he did. Apparently, as I just said, there were spies standing out there watching this, because the Bible says there were people in other nations that heard about what God did for the people of Israel on that day, and they were very afraid because they knew that the people of Israel were coming toward them and that their God was fighting for them and very powerful. So the people of Israel now walked across on dry ground and walked safely into the land that God had promised them. And they were going to face some very big obstacles and some very powerful enemies. There were going to be times when they were going to think, oh my goodness, there is no way out of this. God had brought them this miracle to show them that all they had to do was trust him. All they had to do was obey him. Just do what I'm telling you to do and just believe me and trust me, and I'll take care of you. We've got to realize that God is powerful above everything. If the river is too fast and too deep, he can stop it. If the enemy is too big or too powerful, God can defeat them. If his instructions seem crazy, walk straight toward the river. If his instructions seem crazy, just follow them. It seemed crazy to walk across that river, but that's what God told them to do. They obeyed God, and he opened the way for them. Sometimes there might be no way, but God can make the way. So just trust him. So now they're in the promised land. What do we do now? What they do now is obey God. And you need to come back next time and see what God's going to tell them to do. First thing. And it's going to seem crazy, and it's going to seem too big for them. But if they just obey God, he will fight for them. So come back and see that one. I'll see you next time.